This program is brought to you in partnership with the Immigrant Legal Center.
Welcome to this last installment of Legal USA, a monthly series produced by the New Americans Media in partnership with the Immigrant Legal Center, both of Omaha, Nebraska. We would like to stress that the information provided here is not intended to be legal advice. Viewers should consult a qualified immigration attorney to obtain legal advice on their issue or problem. Today, we will focus on the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. Astrid Munn, a child and family managing attorney with the Immigrant Legal Center, is in the studio with us. Thank you, Astrid, for being here today.
My pleasure, Kayla.
All right, let's start with the definition, just like we have done in every episode. What is the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA?
Yes, so the Violence Against Women Act was a big piece of legislation, federal legislation, introduced into Congress by then Senator Joe Biden in, I think, 1990, that was meant to address some gaps in law enforcement and protecting victims of domestic violence. Finally, in 1994, VAWA, as we know it, was passed.
What does VAWA do for immigrants? How does it help this group?
Yeah, so VAWA, it was sweeping legislation that addressed and touched upon various different aspects of American life. But within the scope of immigration, it created provisions so that the victims of domestic violence could petition for themselves as opposed to relying on an abusive partner like a U.S. citizen spouse or legal permanent spouse to carry them through the immigration process, as is what's traditionally done.
And under VAWA, what do you imply with domestic violence? What is the crime there?
Yeah, that basically means abuse or extreme cruelty on the part of your husband or wife. These provisions now also protect not just victims of an abusive spouse, but also the parents of abusive children and the children of abusive parents. So it's more far-reaching than just a domestic romantic dynamic.
Okay, and when you say the abuser in this case, do I understand it correctly that abuser has a status here in the United States?
Yes, basically there's a phenomenon that happens, unfortunately, where a U.S. citizen or permanent resident individual will have an immigrant husband or wife, and unfortunately sometimes the person with legal status, knowing that they have some power over the spouse who still needs to gain legal status, will use the immigration process to manipulate or threaten or intimidate the person who needs help becoming legal here in the United States.
Okay, and I would like to go back to the eligibility a little further down by the interview, but right here I would like to stop and understand a little bit the difference between UT and VAWA category, U visa, T visa, and VAWA Act. How are they similar and how are they different? From what I have covered, it feels to me that there is some time overlapping of the criminal activity.
I think, from an outside perspective, they would appear to be very similar forms of relief, but they're very different in terms of what the applicant needs to prove, in terms of their pathway to legal status, and in terms of the benefits they can get in the short and long term.
All right, then let's start with the procedure right now. Just like you said, who is eligible for this category?
Yeah, for VAWA, you need to have a familial relationship to the abuser, whether it's your spouse or your recently divorced or deceased spouse, or your child or your parent. you basically have to have some family link. The abuser in the situation has to be related to you, either by blood or marriage. And that's different and distinguishable from applying to a U or T visa, where whoever was hurting you, you don't really need that element of a familial relationship.
And the marriage, it needs to be finalized, to be registered in order for a spouse to be eligible for this category?
Generally, yes. You need proof that you were legally married to them, or I guess in some cases, I think you need to prove that you were under the belief that you were in a legal marriage to the abusive spouse.
Is there any age limitation when it comes to the age of the person that is seeking relief?
I don't believe so. If you are the abused applicant and you have minor children, they may be able to be included in your application, depending on how old they are.
Okay. So what is the procedure here? So I finally decided I'm going to go for the category. What do I need to prove to USCIS or to the person who is considering my case for me to benefit from that relief?
Yeah, well, in the case of a typical VAWA applicant, you would need to prove that you entered the marriage in good faith. That means that you weren't marrying for the purposes of obtaining immigration benefits, because that's fraud. But you entered in good faith, and that the spouse was a U.S. citizen or permanent resident.
Okay. So that's the only proof in terms of documents,
That's the major step that you need to show. You also may need to prove that you resided with this abuser. And then you also need to provide a declaration explaining the abuse or extreme cruelty that you suffered. And that's also another distinction from the U and T visa categories. Particularly with the U visa, you need to prove that you reached out to law enforcement and cooperated with law enforcement.
That's right.
Whereas with VAWA, that is not a requirement. You just need to provide a declaration for the most part.
And what form is involved in this case? Usually there are specific forms for each category. How about this category?
Yes. Here, if you were applying for benefits under VAWA, you would be filing an I-360, which is, I think it's a petition for special immigrants, is kind of the umbrella term for it. And basically, and that's another way that it can be distinguished from U and T visas, and we're getting into the differences in pathways.
Yes.
So VAWA, in the immigration sense, is basically Congress's way of saying, hey, we realize that the person you were relying on to help you gain legal status in the US is not a reliable person because they abused you. So we see that you're vulnerable and you want to be here in the United States. Given your circumstances, we are going to let you petition for yourself, as opposed to husband petitioning for wife or child petitioning for parent or something like that. And so the pathway to permanent residency for VAWA strongly mirrors that of the traditional family-based immigration process. Yeah, whereas U visa, you're applying for a non-immigrant visa, kind of like a student visa or a tourist visa that isn't permanent.
So in this case, if you put the package together, you actually are asking for the legal permanent status. Is that right? You're applying for that?
It's the first step. The I-360 is the first step. Sort of like if I were petitioning for a spouse, I would file an I-130.
Yes.
So this is an I-160.
Okay, so if you are a USCIS goes over it and says, yes, you qualify for it, what's next for me?
From there, and that's getting into the long and short-term benefits. If you are found to be preliminarily, like on the surface while they're processing it, it looks as though you're eligible for VAWA, you can almost immediately apply for public benefits, such as food stamps, health insurance, etc.
Travel, do you get the right to work as well, the working permit?
I think you may. I would
Okay.
have to double check.
Okay.
And then but the benefits come much faster than they would than if you were to take the path through a U visa,
Okay.
where often the wait time can be years.
So this is, let's say, I send the package today. What is the wait time? Since you mentioned it, what is the difference here? What time frame are we talking about
For
here?
VAWA, I imagine it would be a few months.
A few
I
months.
want to say I checked the case processing times yesterday to double check. I want to say that it takes less than a year for it to be reviewed and approved right now.
Okay.
Of course, those estimates can always change, and they're different for every case, but it would be a matter of months as opposed to years with a U visa.
That's right. So you mentioned short benefits and the short-term benefits and long-term benefits. What is the long-term benefit in this case, or when does it come?
Yeah, the long-term benefit is that after your petition gets approved, then just as, you know, a spouse could then, in the family model, could adjust to status to permanent residency. There, you as the applicant can adjust your status to permanent resident through the I-485. Yes.
All right. So that's the second step. Can you submit both forms at the same time?
I don't believe that the one-step process is available for VAWA.
Let's say I am the wife of an abusive husband. I do not have the category. I meet everything. Once I put my application and I'm approved, do I include my children? Let's say I have 2 children that are minor. Do I include my children in my application, or I apply for my children after my status is approved?
I believe if the children are also not U.S. citizens or permanent residents here of the United States, I believe they can be included in your application.
If they are not part of that pact, even after, if mom decides to apply, mom can apply for them. Is that right?
Once mom becomes a permanent resident, then yes, she would be in a position to petition for her children.
For her children.
If they weren't included originally in her VAWA petition. Furthermore, I believe that they can be included if they were also subjected to the abuse. That would also give them possibly a separate claim to and a pathway to residency through VAWA if they were the abused children of a U.S. citizen or permanent resident.
This act actually is Violence Against Women Act. What if I put myself in the shoe of a husband who is abused by his wife? Is it unheard of? Are they protected? Can they benefit from this?
Yes, the
Right.
provisions of VAWA within the scope of immigration are available to men and women. And it's not unheard of for men to apply for benefits under VAWA. They have to just simply meet the same evidentiary standard as a female applicant.
Okay, so you're just a spouse. It doesn't matter the gender.
But yes, even though it's called the Violence Against Women Act, some of its provisions encompass domestic violence of any gender.
Okay. What happens to the abuser? Does he suffer consequences for what he has done to me?
So far as I know, I don't believe that USCIS is or the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, upon receiving VAWA applications and seeing the allegations of abuse, I don't know that they're in the business of then helping launch investigations into the abusive conduct. I think the onus would be more on the applicant to report that him or herself if they choose to. And part of the beauty of the VAWA process is that the abuser doesn't need to be involved at all. They don't need to know that you applied for benefits under VAWA. And they don't have to sign anything or pay any fees or do any of the other paperwork that is normally required in the traditional family-based immigration process.
Yeah. And since you mentioned USCIS, there are several service centers. Where do I send my application?
It may depend on what state you live in.
Okay.
I think traditionally these types of applications may go to the Vermont Service Center,
Okay.
but they may be redistributed based on different offices' capacity.
Okay. How successful is a case under this category? In other words, is it hard to claim this benefit?
I think every case has a pretty high threshold of evidence that you have to show. You have to show that you really have a bona fide relationship, or that you really had a bona fide relationship and it soured and you've suffered abuse. I would say it is as difficult to pursue as any of the other forms of relief. It's all about whether you have the evidence required. But I would say, compared to U visas or T visas, which do require involvement with law enforcement and certification from law enforcement in some cases, I would say that VAWA is a little more relaxed compared to those forms of relief.
Yeah, and it is. It's expressed actually. What you're saying is supported by the processing time as well. U and T visa, it's an extremely long process, especially U visas. But it seems like VAWA, maybe the violence is more pronounced in this context, in the VAWA category.
You know, I don't know the exact numbers or visas. I know each year there's a special number of visas that are given out each year. Each year there's only 10,000 U visas.
Yes.
T visas, there are only 5,000 given out each year. But there are lots more applicants than there are visas available.
Yeah.
With VAWA, I don't know how many visas are allotted per year.
Well, maybe there is not a cap for VAWA.
I know that under the special immigrant category, there is definitely a cap of some kind. I just checked the visa bulletin today, and for children that apply for special immigrant juvenile status, which also requires an I-360, they ran out of visas. So they just have to wait until the beginning of the new fiscal year for the visa line to restart.
And when we say fiscal year, that is?
October 1st of this year.
October 1st of this year. Now, when we talked about U and T visa, for the U visa, your location is relevant, but is not determining if you're getting that relief or not. The T visa, you have to be present in the United States. How about the VAWA? Let's say I am a wife that I decided to go back to my country because I just couldn't stay in that violent relationship anymore. If I decide to go back to my country, can I still apply for the category?
It's my understanding that VAWA is generally designed for individuals that have suffered abuse in the United States.
In the United States.
If you left the country and then came back, you may have to give an explanation as part of your application as to why you came back, and ideally explain how your abuse situation explains why you came back.
Okay. So 1-360 is the legal permanent residence.
I-360, yeah.
Yes. I-360 is the legal permanent resident form. You once it is approved, you become legal permanent resident.
Not quite. I-360 is the petition, so it's just the first step.
Okay.
And that's where you're establishing your basis for getting in line for a visa for permanent residency.
Permanent residency. Now, if this is approved, let's say today, when can I apply for the legal permanent residency?
That would depend on the visa bulletin, which you can always access at the Department of State's website. And I believe that right now, under the I-360 applicants, they have run out of visas for this year.
Okay, so what you're saying is that when you put together the package with the declaration of it and proof of residency and proof of violence and the Form I-360, this is all you have to do in order to gain the green card. Is that right?
Not quite.
Okay.
So it's basically a two-step process.
All right.
You do your I-360, show all the evidence of why you ought to be able to get in the line for the visas, and then once that gets approved and they say yes, you have proven that you were the abused spouse of a U.S. citizen, et cetera, once USCIS says you've fulfilled that, then you can apply to adjust your status, the I-485. So two major applications.
Yeah, two steps, right?
Yes.
The first step that you prove that you were abused and suffered violence, and the second one, a process that every immigrant goes through, the adjustment of status.
Yes.
Right? Okay. And then after that is the path, is the citizenship that depends 3 or 5 years.
Yes.
Right? Okay. While we were talking, another question popped up in my mind. The act was passed in 1994. Do you see an increase in usage of the category or decrease of the usage of the category? Basically, what I'm trying to understand is, are there more women coming forward or spouses that have suffered violence coming forward more than before?
That is a good question. And unfortunately, I was just a kid when Vawa was passed, and I've practiced since 2013, so I really, I feel like my view of things is limited by my age and experience. Okay. So that would be an interesting statistic to pull to see whether application numbers have risen or decreased with time.
Okay. And also, my last question here, Astrid, would be, and this is an opinion, and it's just that during this 6 series, 2 out of the 6 episodes that we have produced under Legal USA are dedicated to categories that involve violence. It was my feeling when I was going through it, and I'm not expecting a definite answer, it's just your opinion, but why there is so much violence? In my opinion, there is so much violence in the undocumented immigrant community. Do you have any explanation or an opinion on that?
Well, I guess I have 2 answers, or a 2-part answer. I guess why is domestic violence and violence observed in the immigrant community? I'm not a social scientist of any sort, but based on my work with immigrant populations, there are lots of factors that contribute to the increased risk of being exposed to violence, whether that's being robbed on the street or encountering domestic violence at home. Those are factors, well, the driving one being poverty, the second one being in not being able to speak English, and also a distrust and unfamiliarity with American institutions like law enforcement, schools, agencies that could help. So those factors work together to increase an individual's risk of encountering violence here in the United States. And as for why are there so many forms of relief geared toward victims of violence, I think that is just a reflection of Congress and a reflection of us, the American people, of us acknowledging that if you came to this country and you are vulnerable and you suffered violence, but you were willing to cooperate with law enforcement, or you were willing to make yourself vulnerable and speak up and stand up for yourself through Vawa, then you should get a leg up in being able to stay here.
Well, thank you, Astrid.
It's been a pleasure.
All right. This was our last installment of Legal USA. All episodes will be available online at www.newamericansmedia.com. They will also be available soon on the Immigrant Legal Center's website at www.immigrantlc.org. Thank you for watching. I am Enkela Bebio.